I welcome you to another Tuesday teaching. This is Learnwithjoes, an Academy of Knowledge Economy. My name is Josephine, your digital educator. I'm here today to continue on the teaching of the arguments for the existence of God. Like I told you last Tuesday, when I went briefly on ontological arguments and Kalam cosmological arguments, I said I'm going to delve more into ontological arguments today. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. But before I go on, let's join Learnwithjoes. As we know, for those who are used to this channel, this is an academy of knowledge economy. We call it Learnwithjoes. My name is Josephine. I'm the digital educator for this channel. This channel is going to actually take a further step forward in interactive method. Soon, maybe in July, we might be going live with shorts, talking with some international people, reputed theologians, philosophers, on some short topics to answer some questions or to say something to us, what we be yearning to know on philosophical or theological issues. But I will be feeding you back as it unfolds. Last Tuesday, I did promise that I'm going to go teach more on the ontological argument, and that's what I'm doing today. Usually, I present PowerPoint slides, and I've always explained why it is so important for me to do that, because of cultural differences in diction, in pronunciation. I want people to follow me. This is an academy of in-depth knowledge, and we want people to understand exactly what we are talking about. So today's teaching is not going to be different from that. So hold on when I show you my PowerPoint presentation. Ontological arguments. As an introduction, you know, ontological argument is the argument that proceeds from the idea of God to the reality of God. You remember last Tuesday when I was saying that if you have, you have in your mind, you provide in your mind of a being that nothing is greater than in your mind. And if you can do that, that means that being that is not greater than exists. So that's the ontological argument. It proceeds from the idea of God, having an idea of God, to the reality of God. And I mentioned about Saint Arsene, who first formulated this idea in his Prologium. René Descartes gives a later famous version of the ontological argument. But Arsene began with the concept of God as that being than which nothing more significant, that is, cannot be greater, can never be conceived. Now let me give an overview. That is a general overview of the ontological arguments. There is a host of arguments, and all of them are based principally on conceptual, that is, a priori grounds, which do not involve a posterior empirical investigation. If a version of the argument works, then it can be deployed using only the concept of God and some model principles of inference. That is, principles concerning possibility and necessity. But the arguments need not receive all empirical support. The focus of the argument is the thesis that if there is a God, then God's existence is necessary. That is why I underline this. I want this to sink in, because that is actually the focus of the argument. If there is a God, then God's existence is necessary. God's existence is not contingent. God is not the sort of being that just happens to exist. So appealing to the way God is conceived in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. And what I mean by Jewish, I'm actually talking about Judeo-Christian one. You understand, the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions may show that this is a plausible picture of what is meant by God. This will involve some posterior empirical research way God is thought of in these traditions. Alternatively, a defender of the ontological argument might hope to convince others that the concept of God is the concept of a being that exists necessarily by beginning with the idea of a maximally excellent being. If there were a maximally excellent being, what will it be like? Let's ponder on that. Suppose you can conceive in your mind an idea that is a maximally excellent being. What will it be like? So it has been argued that among this array of great-making qualities, which we call omniscience, omnipotence, omniscient, will be necessary existence. Once fully articulated, it can be argued that a maximally excellent being which existed necessarily could be called God. The ontological argument therefore goes back to Sister Sam, like I said, but a current version was explored, relying heavily on the principle that if something is possibly necessarily the case, then it is necessarily the case. Or to put it redundantly, it is necessarily necessary. The principle can be illustrated in the case of propositions that 6 is the smallest perfect number. Let's assume that 6 is the smallest perfect number, that number of which is equal to the sum of the divisors, including 1, but not including itself, does not seem to be the sort of thing that might just happen to be true. Rather, either it is necessarily true or necessarily false. If the latter is not, it is not possible. If the former is, it is possible. If one knows that it is possible that 6 is the smallest perfect number, then one has good reason to believe that. Do we have reason to think it is possible that God exists necessarily? In support of this, one can also appeal to posteriori matters, noting the extant religious traditions that oppose such a notion. The fact that the concept of God as a necessarily existing reality seems to be coherently conceived widely across time and cultures is some evidence that the concept is coherent. It is possible there is a God. For God's existence has plausibility, thus can also contribute to believing it is possible God exists. Let's look at the philosophical precept. There is no philosophical precept that from the fact that some exist, it follows that it is possible. If something exists, it is possible. That means it follows that it is possible. A related principle is that evidence that something exists is evidence that it is possible that such a thing exists. There does not appear to be anything amiss in the thinking of God as necessarily existing. If we believe that God exists, is incoherent this is not obvious. Indeed, a number of atheists think God might exist, but conclude God does not exist. Yeah, a group number of atheists, they think it, that yeah, God might exist, but they are concluding that God does not. So if you are successful in establishing the possibility that God necessarily exists, the conclusion follows that it is necessarily the case that God exists. There have been hundreds of objections and replies to this particular argument. And perhaps the most ambitious objection is that the argument can be used with one minor alteration to argue that God cannot exist. Assume all the argument above is correct, but also that it is possible that God does not exist. Atheists can point out that many theists who believe the existence of God at least allow for the bare possibility that they could be wrong. There's no God. I believe God exists. I'm a theist. And there's no doubt or doubt in my heart, in my mind, that I could be wrong. There's no God. I'm sure, and I know God, there is God. So if it is possible that there's no God, then it will necessarily follow that there's no God. Replies to this objection emphasize the difficulty of conceiving of the non-existence of God. The battle over whether God is necessary or impossible is often fought over the coherence of the various divine attributes. If you think the divine attributes are compatible, involve no contradictions, and violate no metaphysical truths, then you may well have the good grounds for concluding that God is possible and therefore necessary. However, if you see a contradiction, say in describing a being who is at once omniscient and omnipotent, you may well have good grounds for concluding that God's existence is impossible. Another objection is that it makes no sense to think of a being existing necessarily. Proposition may be necessarily true or false, but objects cannot be necessary or contingent. Some philosophers reply that it makes no less sense to think of an individual, that is God, existing necessarily than it does to think of propositions being necessarily true. So a further objection is that the ontological argument cannot get off the ground because of the question begging nature of his premise that if there is a God, then God exists necessarily. So does admitting this premise concede that there's some individual thing that such that if it exists necessarily? Replies have claimed that the argument only requires one, to consider an ostensible state of affairs without having to concede initially whether the state of affairs is possible or impossible. To consider what is involved in posting the existence of God is no more hazardous than considering what is involved in positioning the existence of unicorns. One can entertain the existence of unicorns and their necessary features. So when you watch movies sometimes ago, or you go to this they show unicorns and you see that. So you can entertain the existence of unicorns and their necessary features. That necessarily there were unicorns, but they will exist single-horned beasts without believing that there are unicorns. Finally, consider the objection that if successful in providing reasons to believe that God exists, the ontological argument could be used to establish the existence of a whole array of other items, like perfect islands. Reply to this sort of objection, I've typically questioned whether it makes sense to think of an island. You are thinking of a physical thing, of like an island, as existing necessarily, or as having maximal excellence on a par with God. Does the imagined island have excellencies like omniscience, omnipotence, a power which will include the power to make indefinitely many islands and so on? Is that possible for that kind of island? I've really come to the end of today's teaching, but I'd like to mention some scholars, some philosophers who have contributed a lot to the ontological argument. They include Anselm himself, St. Anselm, who first formulated it, Spinoza, and Descartes propound classical alternative versions of the ontological argument, with current versions by Irving Platzinger, Charles Ashton, Norman Markov, and Sidor. Classical critics include Ganillo and Kant, Immanuel Kant, and current critics are many, including William Rowe, James Baines, G. Hoppe, and G.L. Mackie. The latest book-length treatment of the ontological argument is a vigorous defense of the argument. Maybe you like to pick a copy and read more on the ontological argument. It's titled Rethinking the Ontological Argument, and it's written by Daniel Dombrowski. It was published in 2006. Rethinking the Ontological Argument by Daniel Dombrowski, published in 2006. Thank you for joining me today on this ontological arguments. Join me on Friday for Lesson of Life, another one. It's going to be an interesting one, honestly. I tell you that. Trust Josephine. It's going to be an interesting one I'm bringing to you. So definitely, it's going to be interesting. Very interesting, very interesting. So I was just, battle was about getting low. So I need to plug in so that I'm not just cut off like that. I wish you the best of the week. God bless you. I thank all my subscribers. I thank new ones. I thank the viewers. It's only because of you that I'm still holding on. You're the ones sustaining me. Please don't forget to send your comments to learnwithjoes@gmail.com, or check my description link for some of the things that might be interesting you might want to follow. God bless you all.